Well, I'm Professor Loury in the Economics Department in the Watson Institute here. I'm with Briahna Joy Gray, who is the host of the Bad Faith podcast. You guys know the podcast? Some of you know the podcast. And we're here to have a conversation. I think we're still few in the room. We might as well go around. The subject, race, politics, and journalism, grows out of a conversation that Briahna and I had at her podcast, which launched a relationship here, a friendship, I think I could say, a professional friendship. And I hatched the idea that why don't you come up to Brown and we can kick it around a little bit, some of the ideas in the podcast and some of the ideas in the air. I tend to be thought of as a conservative sometimes. Don't get afraid, don't run from the room, it's okay. I'm a reasonable conservative. You're not dealing with a Trump person here, you're dealing with a guy who you'll see says some things that are thought of as a little bit heterodox and on the more moderate to conservative side of the aisle. And Briahna, having worked on the Bernard Sanders campaign and having laid down a track record at her podcast with her interviews and stuff, is a woman of the left. So
also a heterodox thinker, I would say.
Okay.
Quite reviled by the more moderate liberals on my side of the aisle.
So why don't we stimulate a little bit of conversation, then go around the room, let you guys introduce yourselves, and then you're all guys. I notice. I don't know what's up with that.
That's also what my viewership is like on my podcast. When I do a call-in show, and to the extent that you can tell from somebody's avatar, I always try to cherry pick women out of the audience because so few women call into the show.
Women don't call in either.
I don't know, man. I do not know what it's about. I've asked the audience. I don't know what that's about.
Okay. We're going to start. I'm going to play this little clip maybe for 5 or 10 minutes.
I am skeptical that just engaging in this, do better black folks narrative has any demonstrated value at all.
That's an unfriendly way of characterizing my position, but
sure, I'm sorry, I don't want to
no, it's not inaccurate. It's not inaccurate. That certainly is one way of putting it. Not all poor communities exhibit the same extent and nature of pathology that we're seeing in many of the inner city communities that are concerned here. Poverty, straight line, causal to behavioral pathology is refuted by the experience of other communities. We need to be teaching our kids their numbers, their shapes, and their colors. We need to be reading to them. We need to be valorizing that kind of achievement just as much as we valorize other kinds of achievement.
But Professor
We can do both of those things.
Who is not doing that? Because my experience is not that black people don't value education. Quite to the contrary, if you look at who is the most educated group in America, it's currently black women. I'm very glad to be joined by economics professor at Brown University, who's also a prominent social critic, Professor Glenn Loury. Thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Briahna.
So I always love to speak to heterodox voices across the political spectrum, particularly those that make it clear that there is not one kind of monolithic black voice. And as a black progressive, I have also often been I've also, let's say, had my blackness attacked because of my political beliefs, and I suspect that you are in a similar camp. But we both are in the position of making critiques from kind of outside the mainstream school of thought from different directions. So for those who aren't so familiar with your work, would you mind giving kind of a brief synopsis of your critique of kind of the liberal approach to explaining race and racial dynamics in America?
Yeah, well, I've been around for so long and I've written so many things. It's a question of which Glenn Loury do we want to examine here, but let me go with the current version. So I think the anti-racism rhetoric and agitation is barking up the wrong tree. It's not that I don't think there's racism, I know there's racism. But it's that I think the development of the capacities of African American people to realize our full human potential is the fundamental challenge. And I've put this in recent writing in terms of the phrase, the bias narrative versus the development narrative. So the bias narrative is white supremacy, white privilege, discrimination, racism, holding black people down. The development narrative is we got to raise our children, we got to educate them, we need to get busy taking advantage of what opportunities exist. There's too much crime and violence, our families are in disarray. The achievement gap is only partly about the institution. It's a lot to do with the values and behaviors in our community. Let's take responsibility for ourselves. Nobody is coming to save us. Now, that's a rhetoric that is not unfamiliar to people who know something about Black American history. But I think here in the 21st century, with the realities on the ground being what they are, that it's time to revive that kind of rhetoric or to reiterate it, especially as I see so much energy going into what I think is a kind of windmill tilt. People they're angry, they're banging their fists against fate. I mean, microaggressions. I mean, they want to take down statues, and I'm not against the taking down of statues. It's just that I think it's kind of like begging the question of what really are the obstacles in front of preventing African Americans from, achieving a more effective position within the society.
What's so interesting about that is I think that I have, in many ways, similar critiques, where I remember when statue discourse was in full swing, I remember just, asking the question on my first podcast way back when, if we care about people remembering history, is there a way that we can better contextualize statues, put up additional statues, change plaques, reframe them in a way that doesn't seem quite so much like historical erasure? Are there certain figures that are so abhorrent that it's worth taking them down? There are some statues that are so laudatory in their aesthetic that there's no way to recontextualize them in a way that makes sense in a contemporary society. But that, on the whole discourse was kind of missing the forest for the trees of the more substantive conversations about racial inequity. And it became a flashpoint that in some ways was a distraction from a really important conversation that was ongoing about police brutality and the like. What's a little bit more difficult for me is this emphasis or the choice or decision to either emphasize some of these potentially cultural factors that contribute to, let's say, racial disparities versus some of the historical, political, legal, structural factors that are focused. And where I would agree with you is that talking about microaggressions and the like, while at times useful, particularly in kind of an HR context, are very far away from actually addressing any core root causes. But my focus would not be to say, let's talk more about interpersonal dynamics, some critique of Black family life, etc., but to focus instead on remedying those basic structural inequities, like broad economic disparities, poor educational opportunities for huge swaths of the American public, housing inequities, and on and on and on down the line, healthcare inequities and on down the line. What do you make of that?
So there's a substantial ground of overlap there in the, let's not waste our time on relatively superficial and symbolic jousting matches about racial etiquette. Let's focus on fundamentals. As between you and me, there's a fair amount of common ground there. There's a big difference, however, and I respect the position that you just sketched, in wanting to look at material conditions, the economy, the nature of the welfare state, the safety net, and the things that we can achieve through legislation and that the government can do, in preference to talking about character, values, norms, morals, patterns of behavior in our community. And I, as I say, respect, although don't agree, and I don't want to impute a position to you that you don't hold, but many people who take your point of view about sticking to our knitting and let's get the social contract right, think that the behavioral maladies are caused by the material conditions. So violence, okay, we got high homicide rates, we got terrible problems in many cities, as I'm sure you know. And the idea is, well, if we had better jobs, if we had universal health care, we had $15 minimum wage, if we had a decent society, more union power and things like that, and if we had, then we wouldn't have it. And what I'm thinking is,
Here's somebody who takes a pistol and they extirpate a human life, or they fire at random into a crowd. That's barbarity, excuse the word, it's a very strong word. That's awful human behavior. That should be condemned unequivocally. And if I find that behavior to be vastly overrepresented in my community, there's something within my community that is in need of healing. This is almost a spiritual argument. Now, you could say we don't have to choose between these two things. And I could go with you that far, and you and I might not agree about a $15 an hour minimum wage and all of that, but we could at least be talking about that. But at least don't downplay my side of that equation. If I don't have to choose, then let me hear the one who wants the $15 minimum wage also decrying the despicable behavior of a relatively small number of vicious criminals, etc. You see how that language would go. I won't overdo it, okay?
So my issue is not with, I do think there are some people, and the left has been having this conversation more broadly, and so I do think there are some people who are so uncomfortable with certain unflattering statistical realities that they do a sort of group propaganda in various ways, in various respects, right? Where they will at the very least downplay certain statistical realities in favor of others because they have a political objective. And I agree with that political objective on the whole, which is to say, let's advance the policy solutions that are going to address the concerns of that group, as opposed to what the right tends to do with those on their face neutral statistics, which is to say these statistics are an excuse, are justification for withdrawing social support to those same groups. So it's not that I have any discomfort with, let's say, acknowledging the gravity of someone who murders someone else or to take life. But I think there's two things. One, I'm very conscious of the way that can be weaponized to achieve a political end that would exacerbate those harms. And two, I would quibble with the idea that there aren't enormous correlations with poverty, with geographic location, with the prevalence of lead in water, with upbringing and the presence of financial stability of parents and working parents and the ability to have food in the house and people eating breakfast before they go to school and early childhood education and all these things on down the line, the use of alcohol and cigarettes and pregnancy, all of these things have been shown to varying degrees to correlate with criminality and see much more ready explanations than cultural issues. And then, even if that weren't true, I would say that similar to the same reason that I get frustrated with liberals who say we have to culturally change the right, we have to eliminate racism before we do X, Y, and Z, I find the idea that we are going to culturally change any group, and that needs to be kind of like a first step to addressing these pretty grievous social harms, is kind of a fool's errand. Sure, I can sit here and kind of Bill Cosby style tell people to pull up their pants, and sure, I can tell white people to stop being racist, and I don't know what that's going to do. What I do know as a humanist is that there's people who are homeless, there are people who don't have health care, there are people who are food insecure, and that from a policy perspective, that's always, my goal is always to focus a public conversation on those things that we can actually address materially.
This is not the first time I've had this debate.
Sure.
I think I should mention his name, Adonir Usmani, U-S-M-A-N-I. He's a sociologist. He teaches at Harvard. He's an assistant professor of sociology and social theory at Harvard. And he and I have been debating exactly this. He's a man of the left, and he worries a lot about mass incarceration issues. And I'm talking about Adonir, but I'm going to address what you just said momentarily. He has been arguing that he thinks the new Jim Crow narrative, Michelle Alexander and company, is overly simplistic, but he thinks at the end of the day that the root cause is the paucity of the American welfare state. It's the fact that we have, as a society, chosen, he thinks crime's a real problem. He thinks the rise in incarceration is largely a reaction against the rise of violent crime in the 1980s and after. But he thinks that what we did in response to the rise of violent crime was to basically throw people away in the jails instead of addressing ourselves to, as it were, root causes. And I have a couple of responses to that. One is, I think the evidence is less than compelling that throwing money at the root causes, whether it be the schools or whether it be various kinds of social services to indigent populations and whatnot, will deal with the problem of violent crime. That's a kind of rhetoric that we've been hearing a lot of, but I don't know if there really is good reason to believe that that's the case. I mean, you take the children born out of wedlock in single-parent homes and whatnot. Some people try to argue that it doesn't matter, that it's an irrelevancy, and I can't help but think, and I believe there's evidence to this effect, that it's a very important impediment to the full development and flourishing of African American youngsters, that there's so much instability in the interpersonal relations within the social matrix that children are born and so forth. Now, we can fiddle around with the welfare policy all we want to, but we're not really reaching the behavioral basis of the problem if we're not prepared to address these questions of values. And who are we? We are not the white supremacists. We are the African Americans who are most concerned about the well-being of our community. And there's a kind of dignity point here. There's a kind of point that, quite apart from policy, there's an issue of how you want to live in the world and what kind of people we are. And the evocation of wealth gap because of redlining and whatever, in the face of the tragic way that many people's lives are working out, strikes me as morally inadequate. And so again, I reiterate, let's have the argument about policy, but let's not avoid addressing to our fellow African Americans the questions about raise your children, keep your nose clean, live decently. There are right and wrong ways of being in the world, and you're not exhibiting what we want to value as an African American community.
Professor, I guess I would say that it's not that we haven't been having that conversation. I don't know that there is any time that I can recall where there hasn't been a robust nucleus of conservative Black folks, perhaps best personified at this point by Bill Cosby, for better or for worse, that have always, from Booker T through Bill, who have always espoused some version of that. And that doesn't, I certainly wouldn't deny, of course there's an economic reality that having a two-parent household, it infers an enormous amount of economic benefit, whatever the cultural benefits additionally may be, right? I think my entire generation is really smarting from the fact that apartments are, in major cities at least, are priced with the kind of expectation that it's going to be two people to a one bedroom. And if you're a single person in a housing market on one salary, it is extremely difficult to live anywhere near your work in an urban center, for instance. So I don't, and when you say people have thrown money at the problem and it hasn't created an effect, I would say two things. I would say first that there are myriad instances where you can demonstrate significant effect by throwing money at the problem in a smart way. But that typically speaking, the way money is thrown at the problem is exactly that, it's thrown at the problem instead of actually addressing root causes. So busing kids instead of addressing the fact that redlining means that Black people live in these historically deprived neighborhoods, don't get any equity out of their housing value, and as a consequence are victims of a wealth gap and a taxation base that means that their schools are dramatically underfunded, right? That the two things are, one, that I would kind of dispute the premise, but almost more importantly for the purpose of this conversation, even if you think that throwing money at a problem doesn't help, I am skeptical that just engaging in this, do better Black folks narrative has any demonstrated value at all.
Okay. That's an unfriendly way of characterizing my position, but
sure. I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
No, it's not inaccurate. It's not inaccurate. That certainly is one way of putting it.
It's one way of putting it. So this is a conversation. Briahna was kind enough to come up to Brown, sit here in public, and to review the bidding. Why don't we get to know each other? We're only 8 in this room or whatever. You want to tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Charles. I'm a first year at Brown. I don't know how to study.
First year. welcome to Brown. Has it been good?
Yeah.
Good, good. And speak up, please, if you don't mind. I'm a little hard of hearing.
I'm Zach. I'm a junior studying English.
Okay, you don't want to say anything about why you're here or what you find interesting about the subject?
I saw the debate when it came out. It was a treat.
Okay, I don't know what the rule is about people taking their masks down when they speak. Is everybody okay with that? Is that, okay, so it would help me because I didn't bring my hearing aids. I apologize.
I'm Brendan. I am a sophomore studying history. I'm here to find it interesting also to cover this for Briahna Joy.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Paul. I'm a senior studying philosophy and political science. And I've been a big fan of the show for a while, and I really like this debate, and I really liked...
You like what?
I really liked this debate, and I've also taken a class with Professor Loury, so it was very interesting. And I've liked a lot of these episodes too, so I'm interested to hear about everything.
Okay, Paul.
I'm Sam. I'm also studying political science and philosophy, and I'm here because Paul advertised it in our Marx class this morning. So, excited to come.
Hi, I'm Brian Hicks in Africana Studies, and I'm here because Glenn invited me.
I'm Patsy Lewis. I'm a senior fellow at Watson. Ditto.
Brian and Patsy are my colleagues here at Brown, Brian in Africana Studies, and Patsy, you're with the Watson Institute, aren't you?
Yeah.
And are going to be guests at dinner tonight.
Oh, wonderful.
So,
Nice to meet you.
That'll be quite a conversation. She's so patient.
you guys, if you could project a little bit more, if you could speak up, I might have a better chance of hearing you, but it's okay. It's okay. I know everybody's doing the best.
I'm Noah. I'm a sophomore studying anthropology, and I've followed you since the Sanders campaign. So, and I've been meaning to take a class of words. So,
Okay, Noah.
soon, when I get the chance.
Briahna and I just got through with a scintillating hour-long audio podcast taping, in which we went back and forth about Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party and college debt relief and Medicare for all. So
Playing
we're
the
here to
hits.
talk about the future of Black America and about whether or not cultural arguments have any place in it. You heard my more or less passionate advocacy. We heard your effective rebuttal. You want to add anything?
Yeah, I think my basic, first and foremost, I tend to reason from my first principle of as being a humanist. So my first question is, why does it matter? Kind of in terms of my broader policy goals, my broader ethical goals.
Why does what matter?
Whether or not the cause of racial disparities is cultural or something else. Because, what I eventually came around to saying is that if it's cultural, I'm not exactly sure what we can do about it. And I think it might be worthwhile to define what culture is, because I recently had this conversation with Coleman Hughes on his podcast. And when I listened back to it, I think we were going a little bit in circles. And it sounded like I was denying kind of the existence of culture, because I think we were talking about two different things as being culture. I heard even in that exchange, there was a reference to, whether or not it's advantageous to have two parents in the household. Some people might call that cultural. I kind of framed it as a material issue, because I don't think it's like the psychic value of having married parents that necessarily confers the benefit. I think stability confers the benefit. I think having two earners confers the benefit, or at least having, free, the child care of one parent staying at home while the other one works is a benefit and cost savings. And it's not necessarily what I would describe as culture, because so often when people are having conversations about what culture is, it seems to me that there's often a political agenda attached, where folks are trying to say, there's no point in doing these social programs, these people are culturally deficient, you can't change them, they're deciding to have babies out of wedlock and do socially aberrant things, this is not my responsibility, I shouldn't be spending my tax dollars on it, it's culture, it's not my issue. You're interesting because you're in this space where you're saying, I think it's cultural, but also have an investment because of your, affectionate investment in your own community in changing it, but I still am not especially confident that that can be done in any meaningful way outside of changing people's material realities. So for instance, everyone was making fun of, I think maybe Ben Shapiro or Charlie Kirk, maybe the other day, I think it's Charlie Kirk, because he was talking about how the higher people live in a building, the more like radical they become. And this is why cities are bad, and like you have to be close to the ground, and like have your nose in like the loam, and all of this kind of stuff. And it was an absurd kind of sounding statement, but there obviously is a lot that's true about urban design and its effect on behavior, and how building tall skyscrapers with these corridors and dark places causes more crime than when people have social public housing that's low to the ground. You have a garden and you feel like you possess it, and you can, you're responsible for how beautiful it is and all that stuff. People have more pride in their property. Like, that is obviously true. And so if you want to change behavior, I'm like, okay, well, let's do urban design. Let's change, people's commitment to their spaces. Not let's lecture them about why did you get pregnant so young? Let's think about why they got pregnant so young and not assume it's something intrinsic. Because if it is something intrinsic, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. So we might as well try to see how we can socially influence behaviors, and all the way that social psychologists know that we can socially influence behaviors without that judgment that I think is actually precluding action.
Okay, so this is going to seem like a trivial example. It's on the question of what is culture, or
Sure.
why should we care? So it used to be that African Americans were willing to laugh at Amos and Andy and shuffle along, were processing their hair in order to try to make it not look kinky, were viciously status conscious about skin tone hierarchy of light skin being better, good hair being better, and whatnot. And don't you call me black, I ain't black, kind of thing like that. And there was a revolution within Black American society of self-understanding and self-consciousness about black is beautiful, about the need to affirm our negritude, our Africanness and whatnot. And that was a real transformation of our consciousness. It had political ramifications. It interacted with nationalist sentiment in African American political life. And it was a change that was brought about through a variety of different influences in the arts, in public leadership, in journalism and activism and so on. And that was a transformation of the sense of what it meant to be a dignified black person in the world that happened within my lifetime. I was born in 1948. Does that register in your mind as something that was A, cultural, and B, was very much a good thing to have been brought about? And didn't get brought about by government policy, it got brought about by the internal dynamics of influence, leadership, and so on within Black American society.
Yeah, so, culture is real. Culture changes. And I would argue, I'm not a cultural historian or a historian of any kind, even though I am a history of science and history of art undergraduate major. I never really cared for history. I feel as though it bore a relationship to Black people's political self-determination at the same time. So while you say Black people were happy to consume Amos and Andy and kind of relished straightening our hair and subscribing to Eurocentric beauty standards and all of that, I do think that when you were living in a white hegemonic space and subject to all of the advertising and the cultural signifiers and all of that that's going on, it's very difficult to escape those values. People in a contemporary context continue to find it difficult to escape those values. The values are changing and Black aesthetics are more influential and all of that. But, so I think that that's one thing. And as Black people got more political freedom and were advocating in a really meaningful way at that time, I don't think it's an accident that Black and Beautiful comes up at the same time as the Civil Rights Movement, that it's all a part and parcel of people's political self-determination. And it happened, to your point, organically and not because of any directive from the government. So yes, I agree with you, but it's not entirely clear to me what role a government would play in changing culture. Now, have you by any chance seen the movie Claudine with a young James Earl Jones playing a Garbage Man.
The movie's
and-
called Claudine?
Uh-huh.
I don't think I've seen it, but
It's a 70s classic. My mother made me watch it.
okay.
And I bring it up because it is, one, it's got Lynn Whitfield starring as the protagonist, and she's a maid for white families in the 70s, and she's got a bunch of kids. Too many kids, 8 or something, a lot. And they live in the housing projects, and things are very rough. The kids get into trouble, but she's loving and she's doing her best. Father is absent. She meets James Earl Jones. They start a relationship, and one of the fascinating unintended lessons of the movie is the way our social programs, our current social policies, are designed to discourage her from having this relationship with James Earl Jones, because her welfare benefits were determined on her singlehood. And so he would bring things to her that he had gotten in the trash, a working iron, a lamp, and the social worker would come by the house, and the kids had to scramble and hide everything new, lest that they think she had more income or that there was a man living in the house. Because the second there's a man living in the house, which obviously would have helped the family, sharing rent, social stability, all the things we say we want, she would have been immediately cut off of those social benefits. And so I do think there's a way to change culture, if you want to call it culture, that she was a single woman with a bunch of kids and all of that stuff. But it's not by saying, gosh, Lynn Whitfield, go track your husband down and force him to come back wherever he is, like she has any control over that. The question is to say, what is it in our current social design that incentivizes this behavior or that behavior?
Well, understand, I'm not prescribing a Bill Cosby recipe of lecturing people and wagging my fingers in their faces and telling them to be good. I'm saying as we sit as intellectuals and try to get our minds around what's going on, taking on board and taking seriously the fact that patterns of behavior that may be reinforced for all kinds of reasons and that become self-reproducing and that have with them expectations and norms that then get adopted by people and that affect the way that they interact with each other, and like violence, is a part of the problem. And whereas a lecture or a sermon may not be a solution, the act of lecturing and sermonizing, amongst other things, on behalf of articulation of a sense of self-understanding for African Americans, which we would pass on to our children, which we would echo in our voluntary organizations like our churches and our synagogues, mosque or whatever it might be. Could be a part of the conversation. So I want to put the value questions on the table, and I ask you to address yourself to this, not only for the efficacy, not only as a matter of cause and effect, if we do this, then that will happen, but also for the point of dignity, for the point of an affirmation of a self-understanding and a way of life that is honorable. I want to say that when we see amongst our own people ways of acting which are dishonorable, we should be willing to call them out. And the we here is not a political we. You say it can be weaponized. I agree that it can be weaponized. This is not running for Congress. This is a we that is internal to the community. I mean, I ask you, is the Nation of Islam, as a historical phenomenon within African American society, a cultural phenomenon? I think it is largely a cultural phenomenon, and I think the legacy of Malcolm X points out how important that option is in our advocacy, how everything is not politics, everything is not electoral politics. A lot of stuff is teaching our people to see themselves in a way that allows them to function more effectively in the world.
So I hear you saying, and I heard it in the playback, a desire for a kind of almost moral accountability and acknowledgement of a problem, even if we aren't yet to the solution stage. I hear that, and I want to validate that there are certainly, as I said in the clip, there are spaces on the left that don't want to talk about anything unpleasant, any bad facts, increased crime in this community, and that, like, they don't want to talk about it because it feels like they're either worried about the political consequences of admitting too much, or they're embarrassed. And I don't feel like that's where I'm coming from, because I'm pretty confident about what I think is the cause of a lot of those things, and I don't think it's about morals. You're asking me here's my issue. I guess you want me to, you're interested in whether or not I think it's, you want me to kind of condemn people who have done the socially aberrant thing. There are some socially aberrant things that I'm perfectly happy to condemn. Don't kill people, it's bad. You know, don't hurt people, don't do a violence. I'm very comfortable saying those kinds of things. The bit where I'm supposed to say, you know, you really messed up because you got pregnant as a teenager. I mean, obviously no one wanted the person to get pregnant as a teenager. I have a hard time, I'm sorry. You know, they know they messed up and they feel like crap already. And I know that part of this is coming from a kind of a personal place where I reflect on, you know, my own family. And so much of this, I mean, my mother's somewhere going, Briahna, stop putting everybody's business out. But like, you know, my grandma, I think I've talked about it on the show before. My grandmother was a teen mother. She had my aunt when she was 16 and my mom when she was 17. You know, it was an older guy. No one ever talks about him and what he did wrong, right? It's all about the mother and all of that. It was, you know, in the late 50s, early 60s, so she was shipped off to one of those homes for wayward girls where she had to give birth to these 2 kids as a kid herself alone. You know, it makes me so sad to think about it. And she came from a good family. My great-grandmother was very strict and all of those kinds of things. But, you know, they didn't teach her about birth control. They didn't tell people about things. And she had sex with this guy apparently and got pregnant immediately, you know. And she has still to this day a lot of shame about it. She got it together. She became a registered nurse. Everything's fine. She married my grandfather, my biological grandfather, but the man I knew as my grandfather. But it's like, I'm struggling to see the social benefit. When I look at the examples of people in my life who have ended up in situations, neighbors' kids who've gotten knocked up and stuff like that, even that terminology, knocked up, who became pregnant, I'm just really struggling to understand the social utility of heaping on shame when the whole gestalt of our society is all the things you're saying. Of course you're supposed to get married. Of course you're not supposed to have sex till you're married. All of the Puritan stuff, that's the whole country. We're just breaking out of that a little bit, and suddenly it's like you want to slam the door and be like, but don't you know what you're doing is bad? Everyone knows it's bad. We're all pressured all the time to toe this straight and narrow. It's not like anybody's laboring under some delusion that like totally teen parenthood is the bomb.com and our ultimate goal. And I do think that there are some discrete communities where there's so much dysfunction because there are not a lot of examples, because there's so much concentrated poverty and there have been so many generations of that there's very little modeling of it. It's not so aberrant that people feel as much social stigma as they do out in the broader world. And maybe that's a problem. I mean, of course that's a problem. But I don't know if you fix that by just going in and saying that's a problem. I think you fix it by having sex education. I think you fix it by passing out birth control and having condoms in bathrooms and having universal health care so girls can be taken and go on the pill if they want to or get an IUD if they want to when they become sexually active because they're regularly seeing a doctor who suggests such things when it comes up. And to have educational opportunities so they have something to aspire to and not think, well, I don't have anything else going on, I might as well have this baby.
Well, yeah, I'm for all of that. And I'm not for taking little girls who find themselves in a tough situation and badgering them or tattooing a scarlet A on them or whatever. And I have my own personal stories I could tell, but I won't tell them.
Yeah, because you're a better child than I am to my mother.
But I just have the feeling that the discourse, I mean, we don't have any trouble telling people about white supremacy, and we don't have any trouble teaching people that they're victims, and arguing.
Well, do you think there's not white supremacy in that people aren't victimized sometimes, some people?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I don't see a political agenda in that. What I see is etching in of the deep separation between a non-trivial part of the African American community and the engines of opportunity that exist in the society. And I see a kind of rhetoric that fits the moment and has its adherents, but that I don't think is doing very much for our people. And
I mean, where we agree.
I mean, if you were to say to me, let's not talk about white supremacy, let's talk about how the political economy is organized, and we're going to have a debate, neoliberal economists versus democratic socialist policy wonk. And we could talk about 15-hour minimum wages or about health care for all, universal Medicare or whatever. That would be one thing. To take the race question and to embed it within this conversation about 200 years, 400 years, white supremacy and whatnot, I don't see any useful politics coming out of that. I mean, we've had a decade of that. We've had a decade of that with Black Lives Matter and policing and whatnot. And I don't, you tell me, you're the political operative. You tell me what the political fruit of the racial reckoning has been. I mean, I see a lot of book sales, I see a lot of chatter, but I don't see anything that's really touching the ground. And I'm saying all this to say, it's not as if I only want to give sermons about 70% of black kids being born to a woman without a husband. While I think that's a signature fact about our contemporary time with real consequences for the long-term development of our people, I don't simply want to say that. But I don't see this white supremacy rhetoric leading to any politics of repair and restoration for our community.
Yeah. One thing to that point about the out-of-wedlock stat is there's some fascinating statistics about men, and I experience this in my dating life. Men love to talk about how they don't feel financially stable enough. And a lot of men feel a lot of pressure to do that before they get married. Now, obviously, they shouldn't be fathering children either if they don't feel financially stable. But there's a relationship between people's kind of precarity or perceived precarity and their desire to get married and willingness to do the traditional family life that is economically and arguably socially beneficial. But I would agree with you that there are certain maximalist arguments about the nature of racism and white supremacy that I think are harmful because they're so maximalist, attenuated from any actual policy goal. And this is what the critique of identity politics is from the left. It's that there's a cohort of people who writes the books and goes on the shows and buys the $6 million houses in Hollywood or wherever. I know it's not Hollywood because Hollywood's supposed to be bad, right? It's like poor. I don't know. It's like it's not a high income neighborhood. But don't ever talk about any of the things that are, I think, materially driving the outcomes they say they don't want. And they're collecting $90 million and $60 million of it is unaccounted for. In the case of the Black Lives Matter national organization, we had that young man on the show.
Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation.
Yeah. Sean Campbell wrote those 2 exposés in New York Magazine, and we have to have him back. So, from my perspective as a leftist, I'm frustrated that there is a way that everyone's figured out the race game, and Joe Biden thinks he can have Kamala Harris or appoint a black Supreme Court justice, which is well and good. I mean, not the Kamala Harris part, the Supreme Court justice part seems well and good, but not do anything substantive. And that's an excuse for him to have betrayed all his campaign promises, not just to cancel $10,000 of student debt, but to cancel all HBCU student debt for everybody making $125,000, which everyone has very collectively forgotten about, he said. Saying to all the people in Georgia directly, explicitly, if you go and vote for Ossoff and Warnock and get us the Senate, we're going to send you $2,000 of checks. $2,000 checks in your bank account, explicit direct quote from Joe Biden, and then he immediately reneged and said, oh, it's the 1,400 plus the 6. All these things people have not forgotten about who actually live in these places, and we're going to all find out about that in midterms in a second. That he can not actually meet the needs of communities. If we had a $15 minimum wage, that would be a raise for 38% of black Americans. Those are the kind of things we're not talking about and that he's not doing. I could go into the Medicare for All disproportionate health effects and how the maternal mortality gap, which everyone loves to talk about. Did you notice that suddenly in 2018-19, the entire conversation was about the maternal mortality gap? Everyone was suddenly extremely concerned about the maternal mortality gap. The number one way to close the maternal mortality gap would be to provide universal health care for people. Because what's driving one of the biggest parts of the gap is poverty, and people who are on Medicaid are getting worse medical service than mothers who have private health insurance. Now, what neoliberalism does is say, look, here's Serena Williams, who's obviously very affluent, and she had a tough pregnancy and was subject to medical discrimination, which is a total thing and a separate thing from some of these other issues that are really driving the gap. It's a thing, and it matters, and it's bad. We should have black doctors not have so much student debt, so they have to go be anesthesiologists and plastic surgeons to pay it off and go back to their communities and service them, but never mind. Everything does tend to intersect when you're a leftist, though, I will say. But we got all these stories about Serena Williams because they wanted to remove it from this class issue, remove it from this material issue, and make it about, God, isn't it hard for rich black people? Every story, Philando Castile can get shot in his car by a cop because his taillight is out and he has a bunch of outstanding tickets that he can't pay because he is a beloved cafeteria worker at his school getting paid pennies.
That's the guy in Minneapolis.
I'm sorry, I honestly, it's a tragedy that I get Minneapolis? Okay. But we're not having a conversation about why the man.
Philando Castile?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Minneapolis.
Yeah. We're not having a conversation about why the guy can't pay off $400 worth of tickets and is getting pulled over all the time. Okay. Instead we're talking about how, Oprah got racially discriminated against when she tried to buy a $40,000 purse, and how dare the store not sell Oprah the purse. Everything gets like, the tennis player, that black guy, Blake something, who got tackled outside of a hotel because it got racially discriminated against. I don't like that. I don't want that to happen. I get asked all the time to get people stuff in stores, whatever. I'm alive. The tennis player is alive. Philando Castile is dead, and acting like all these things are the same. My colleague Zed Jelani at the Intercept, I know, people have their takes, but he points out that 100% of instances of police violence are happening in neighborhoods under $200,000 a year. Now you can say that's a big range. Under $100,000 a year. Over $200,000 a year, there's like nothing, zero. None of this is happening in affluent neighborhoods. But you want to divorce the class aspect out of all of this. And that, for the left, is the issue with the race politics, that it becomes this maximalist, abstracted conversation where you can think giving your donation to some, Oberlin grad who is going to make a hype house for race videos in LA, that's social justice. Buying Kendi X. Wiley's book is social justice. Electing Barack Obama is social justice. Putting Ketanji Brown Jackson on the court is social justice. And some of those things might be okay. They might even be good. They might even be helpful. Ketanji Brown Jackson's probably the best of those because she at least is a public defender, and I stand public defenders. But the rest, it's a distraction. And all of these white liberals, these well-meaning white liberals, are eating it up. And they have no clue that the left even exists. They have no clue that the discontent even exists. And to the extent that a lot of the people who are unhappy are going to watch Tucker Carlson because at least he's talking in populist terms, they're just like, Red Brown Alliance. This is all racist tripe. I don't have to pay attention to these people. Their political disagreements or political concerns don't matter because of the aesthetics of their politics. They watch Fox, maybe they're white, maybe from the Midwest, all of these things. And so it goes unnoticed, and it's broiling, and it's gonna boil over. And I'm hopeful, I would love it if it got channeled into a leftward direction and we had a Bernie Sanders-style presidency. But that doesn't look like it's happening because the Democratic Party is more hostile to the progressive populists than the Conservative Party is hostile to right-wing faux populism.
How do you account for that? I mean, let me ask you this. So James Clyburn is probably more responsible than any other single person for Joe Biden being president.
Correct.
You know the argument, South Carolina primary and him throwing his weight to Biden.
60% of black voters in South Carolina
And that
said
was
they
a
based
black
it on
voting
that.
primary, and those are our people. And they did not choose your enlightened path. They chose the conventional Democratic Party path. What's up with that? Is it false consciousness? People don't really understand their interests?
For decades, race was a not terrible proxy for the more progressive, the political candidate that was going to do more for the people. We didn't used to get anybody who was black for the longest. It was like Reconstruction, blip, and then nobody until the 80s, 90s, sort of, a little bit. And Black people, of course, were going to trust the judgment of their own folks. We have been fighting for that representation for so long. So representation held some weight for a long time, and I don't judge people who felt that way. Most people are tired. They're not sitting around on Twitter for 10 hours a day like I am, consuming every news piece. Everyone has to reason by proxy. They find their politics by proxy. Who did my mom vote for? What did this politician that I know and like say? What did Barack Obama say? I don't think that makes you stupid. That's how the world works. We all jump to those, we all, reason by proxy because we don't have the bandwidth to do every little thing. And James Clyburn is very popular. He's been in his seat for like 30 years. He's finally getting challenged this year, by the way, which those of you who listen to my podcast know. I interviewed an interesting guy.
Challenged by whom?
Two people, one who I think is kind of like a neoliberal, and this other guy named Marcus, sorry, I'm blocking his name.
These are Democrats.
He, I think, describes himself as progressive, but he has some hot takes. He is not pro-choice, which is it's going to be a hang-up for a lot of people on the left, although might be worth it to some folks just to get Clyburn out. And that was a conversation we had on the podcast.
It is South Carolina.
It is South Carolina. Now, Jim Clyburn, I must say, because I feel contractually obligated, the contract I signed with my values and ethics, to say this every time I get a platform to say it, takes more money from the pharmaceutical industry than anybody else in Congress. And there is a reason why anyone else in Congress, not in the House, in both chambers. And there is a reason why he is so solidly allied with Joe Biden. It's also worth noting, and one of the things that came out of the interview with the candidate that I found to be notable is that his district is so poor. It's like the 6th poorest district in America, Jim Clyburn's. He's been there for like 30 years, reigning over the 6th poorest district in the country. People there are, you know how South Carolina is. My great-grandmother of the story, it was from South Carolina, was a sharecropper up from there. Like, it's the pits, man. And our people are living in these conditions, and not one word of accountability ever comes Jim Clyburn's way. I had no sense. I just assumed he was like from a major city, a major urban area. No, he's not, and it's not going well there. And so instead of having a conversation about what's going on in his district, personal accountability, getting these people out of office without being in there for these 30-year terms, Dianne Feinstein teetering around doing God knows what, calling kids jackbooted tots because they want her to, not kill the environment. In California, our progressive bastion, like this is where we are. And all of it, everyone gets away with it. I'm sorry, because Jim Clyburn's Black, and no one has politics beyond the identity politics among liberals. They've been completely ruined. And I'm not just talking about Black people. Black people, I kind of understand why you want to vote for a Black person, care about a Black person. It's on some level, white liberals believing that they're doing a good thing by supporting these Black candidates. When Bernie was running in 2016, I had so many white people on Facebook and at my law firm coming up to me saying, you can't like Bernie, Black people don't like Bernie. And I was like, David. There were 3 Davids in my 12-person law firm. And I was the only Black attorney at this law firm. What are you saying? Literally, what are you saying to my face right now? But that is the brain warp that's going on. They truly just Briahna, Black people don't like Bernie. I had that conversation dozens of times that year. So much so that it made me angry enough to start a podcast and launch this whole trajectory that I've been on ever since.
Okay. Well, you have been sufficiently provoked, I think. Why don't we have 30 minutes or so here for discussion? Why don't we open it up? And we're graced with the company of Briahna Joy Gray. And you've heard her. Let's have some conversation with her. So the floor is open. Questions or comments, statements? You can speak into the microphone because we're webcasting. You can just pull it over and talk into it.
Oh,
It won't amplify your voice in the room. It'll just make sure you get heard by the audience in the recording.
You seem to be not super happy with the idea of this white liberal caring a lot too much about race. Over things. Not even caring too much about race, but using it as
having too superficial of an understanding of what's going on, that they will follow the lead of anybody who is Black. regardless of their substantive politics. Yeah.
The 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign was a lot more, I would say, catering towards this white liberal idea of Ibram X. Kendi guilt.
You mean the 2020 campaign?
Yes, 2020 campaign compared to the 2016 campaign. What was the reason for that shift?
People made that argument a lot.
Can you just repeat the statement? 2020 campaign?
It was catering more to like the identity politics rhetoric than the 2016 campaign.
And is that true?
Well, I'm going to ask you what kinds of observations you made that led you to that conclusion. What kinds of things was Bernie saying that felt like that was the case?
This is not my observation. I read Ezra Klein's book last week when he
Yeah.
came to visit, and he said that in his book.
Yeah. Is that why everybody's saying this right now?
I don't know. I mean, he wrote his book like, what?
He's such a...
He wrote his book a while ago, but...
Did he point to any evidence of that in the book? Or was this like a kind of a cursory statement?
I can pull up the book if you want.
Yeah, let's work on that while we're doing this. What I observed, so I asked someone this recently, who was I talking to? It was on the podcast. Who did I just interview? I was just talking to somebody who made this case, and when I pushed them to explain what they were talking about, they said, well, he says, oh, maybe it was Norm Finkelstein. They said, in every race, in every, the little preamble that he puts at the beginning of the speech, welcome everybody, and we're going to make America better for blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans, and like he just runs through the list real quick of the kinds of people there are. And to me, that preamble is just a preamble that if you're, triggered by someone acknowledging like, oh, the diversity of this coalition is good, now let's talk about economics, I don't know what to do with you. Like, I don't think that is enough to change the message. Now, I think what was true and what did happen was he spoke less about, not that he spoke more about identity politics and that was a problem, is that he spoke less about some of the core issues that drove the 2016 campaign, like corruption, hitting Hillary hard on that, talking about the banks, talking about financial fraud, being willing to name names in a way that he didn't with Biden, because I think he sincerely liked Joe Biden. But I am concerned that there's an emerging narrative, apparently thanks to Ezra Klein, that the real problem is talking too much about the reality of identity.
The problem is that I don't remember, but I did hear him with my own ears make a statement. I mean, I love Bernie Sanders, but I'm like, this man doesn't understand race. He doesn't think race is important, and race is important. Class is hugely important.
So that's so
I
interesting.
cannot remember, but it's not reading anybody, but it's something that he said.
So you two are kind of
Answers
saying
our
different
question.
things. You're saying that you felt like he didn't talk about race, or he was
That
talking
he
about
didn't
it.
appreciate
He didn't understand
the
race.
importance of race.
But the narrative from Ezra Klein is that he talked about race too much. And those aren't just like opposite things. Yeah, let's hear it. Read it into the record.
Bernie Sanders is a good example here. In 2016, he centered his campaign on class and was criticized for a tin ear on race. Ultimately, he won slightly more white votes than Clinton, but was swamped by her 50-point margin among African Americans. In 2020, Sanders has run a more race-conscious campaign, emphasizing his past as a civil rights activist. And then this is a quote. I protested housing discrimination, was arrested for protesting school segregation, and one of the proudest days of my life was attending the March on Washington, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said in his announcement speech, his campaign has hired more non-white staffers, worked harder to build relationships with black political leaders, and released plans to address the 5 central types of violence waged against black, brown, and indigenous Americans: physical, political, legal, economic, and environmental. And then it goes on to talk about a similar sort of dynamic with open borders, where he wasn't against, or he was like openly against open borders in 2016, and then in 2020 was more open to this idea of larger immigration reform.
Yeah, so, okay. I think in an inaugural speech, I would ask you who, anyone, anywhere, doesn't say something about why they're going to be good for one of the major constituencies in America. If I put up Joe Biden's speech, who won? This is an argument about like what hurt Bernie, right? Okay, if I pull up Joe Biden's speech, who fully is the president of the United States right now, I promise you he's going to say a lot of things about what he's done for black people over his life, which is nothing good, but he spun it into something good. Joe Biden spent time decomposing on the campaign trail, talking about how he was a lifeguard in a black pool and how all the black kids love to touch his leg hair. He lied several times. He lied about getting arrested with Nelson Mandela. He lied about participating in civil rights marches in Delaware, which I only recently discovered has a huge black population. It's like Wilmington is like 50% black. And all of this stuff. He talks about it nonstop. No one's saying Joe Biden failed to win because he talked too much about race, right? So what they're doing is Bernie can't win. In 2016 rather, to everyone's point, everyone argued that he was bad on race because Hillary Clinton got more black voters. It wasn't ever really a substantive argument either, that he said something and did something. They tried to get him once. He quoted some racist in his book, and it's a book on, he reads the audio recording, so there's Bernie Sanders' voice reading the racist quote using the N-word, and at one point someone tried to get him, like, Bernie says the N-word. I mean, they tried stuff like that, but nothing really stuck. I agree with you that there were moments where I felt he was tone deaf. For example, I begged him once to please stop telling the Martin Luther King story because I knew that there was a hostile audience that was going to take it as, what have you done for us lately? You can't keep rehabilitating this Martin Luther King story as evidence of what you're going to do for black people today. And Bernie's entire policy agenda is great for black people, and I was trying to help him understand how to characterize what he's already doing in that light. Because I know that we live in a world where you have to label something as a black specific policy or a lot of people aren't going to care about it. And this is another one of my pet peeves. I'm sorry, I know that I'm like going all over the place. I'm going to table the pet peeve. But the point is that, like, Bernie couldn't win for trying. So while I agree that there were these moments where he was tone deaf, I think he also was sincerely very proud. I privately talked to him about how proud he was of the housing integration work he was doing at the University of Chicago. I'll tell you what Hillary Clinton wasn't doing at the same time as she was a Goldwater girl, aggressively not participating in the civil rights movement. I think that kind of demonstration of integrity matters. All I did in college was join an a cappella group,
Do you think Joe Biden was pandering for black votes when he committed to choosing a black woman for his vice president?
Of course he was.
And a black woman for his first
Of course he was.
appointment?
Also, there's something wrong with
Is that a bad
pander.
thing?
I mean, you're a politician. You're supposed to be offering people something in exchange for their vote. I mean, that's what you're supposed to be doing. I think it should be things that aren't so superficial. But the whole point of politics is to say your life is bad, or it could be better, and here's how I'm going to improve it. This is what I'm going to do to improve it.
Is Bernie too pure a socialist committed to his vision of organizing society that he wouldn't stoop to such tactics if they could abet his electoral prospects?
I don't think it's stooping. I don't know. Do you want to get in here? Yeah, it's your job.
She's doing fine, right?
I mean, it's your job. What do you want him to say? Like, screw all of
What was his position
you?
on reparations?
Well, this was the 2016 thing they tried to get. Well, they did get him on. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders all gave the exact same opinion on reparations in Ta-Nehisi Coates' article that got Bernie in so much trouble, right? They all said, maybe there's like a moral debt of some kind. I mean, yeah, sure, it's terrible what happened to black people, but I don't think that's the way forward. All three, like almost identical quotes. But Ta-Nehisi Coates' logic was that because Bernie was willing to do moonshots in other areas, that he was willing to fight for policies that weren't necessarily polling well, because Medicare for All, it didn't have the 88% support back in 2016 the way that it does now. So Coates was saying, if Bernie is willing to fight for things that aren't popular, why fight for all of these white, in quotation mark, things and not this thing that's for black people? I support reparations. And when I felt like I was about to join this campaign, I hadn't agreed to it yet, but I knew it was coming, I very quickly wrote 2 articles of support of reparations to make my personal stance known before I got pulled into the campaign orbit. I wish Bernie supported reparations. But the idea that he was a less good candidate than Hillary Clinton, which was the context at the time, I think was not right. And I think it also ignored the extent to which the difference between Medicare for All and some of these policies that Bernie did support, even if they're moonshots and reparations, is that Bernie's fundamentally a populist. He is going to go for something that is going to affect a majority of people. And when you have an economic worldview that is so principally focused on eliminating a bottom tier economic class, the idea of turning your attention to a racial class that is largely coterminous but not exactly overlapping with that class and prioritizing that, it's a kind of anti-populist. I think I support reparations, but it's not a populist goal, because 50% of poor people in America are white. You know what I mean? There is going to be a anti-populist optics of saying we're going to prioritize giving me reparations while someone else is over there poor. And I see reparations differently. I see it as kind of like in a tort framework, where when there's damages, you get paid. If I'm in a car accident and someone injures me, I don't not get a payout because I'm already affluent. And I urged folks to think about designing reparations program along those lines, where it's basically a tort, like a mass litigation that targets a lot of the corporations that were extant during slavery, and that you can actually just get your money back. So like Aetna, for instance, that came up in our earlier conversation, made all this money off insuring slaves for their owners, you know,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And let the public argue about whether or not Aetna shouldn't be stripped of money to give to black people, instead of like your tax dollars going to pay a Harvard student or whatever.
Did you read Mark Lillard's book some years ago, Once and Future Liberal?
No, I just read many articles about it.
It's controversial. I mean, he has this line in there. He says, identity politics is Reaganism for lefties. By which he means every group has got its own interest, and if what you need is a working class coalition that cuts across identity lines, whereas Reaganism is simply, you know, I got mine, Jack, F you. It's, you know, private property and minimal state. Identity politics is every group is advocating for its own interest, and the ability to see the knitted together character of class interest that cuts across those lines is obscured by identity politics. Do you agree with that kind of argument?
So I try to be careful and say that I am not critiquing identity politics. I'm critiquing the weaponization of identity politics. I'm critiquing all the ways that it's being exploited. I don't have a problem with identity. We all have them. There's the hat contingent over here. You know, we're in this purple plaid contingent.
Yeah, but we should keep it in its place, right?
Well, the whole point of intersectionality, which has now become like a buzzword, if implemented and if understood properly, it's supposed to be not that I'm a woman and you're a man and therefore we have these conflicting interests. It's that I'm a woman and I have interests that are related to that, and you're a man and you have interests that are related to that. We're both black and maybe we have mutual interests on those grounds, and the fact that I'm black and a woman means that the fact that you're black and a man maybe means our interests, our racial interests are slightly different than each other, but that we can find the commonality because all of us share some kind of interest along one of these lines. And I think what creates the division among identities is the exclusion of class as one of the identity politics metrics we should be talking about. If class were one of the many identities that were being considered in an intersectional analysis, then the continuity between our interests would be much more obvious. And the original women who came up with intersectionality were Marxists, and they understood that. It's just been horribly bastardized since the Columbia River Collective came up with this stuff.
Okay, anything from the philosophy corner over there? Not to put you on the spot, but I thought you might want to.
Cool, yeah. So religious observance in America has been going down pretty rapidly over the last 30, 40 years. And I'm not sure about the specific statistics for the black church, but I'm pretty sure it's comparable. I'm wondering if either of you think that this is a problem, and whether or not you think there are things that the government could do to reverse this trend. But if it's not a problem, then obviously the second part of the question is
just tell me, what's the problem?
Well, constitutionally, I feel like the answer to number 2 is no. Whether the government can do anything to encourage religious participation. I mean, they already give like tax protected status, which I would argue they shouldn't do. I mean, just like constitutionally, I feel like they shouldn't do.
Yeah.
Not because I have it out for religious institutions. I think that there's a lot of value in spirituality. I've been talking about this a little bit on the podcast. I talked about it with Marianne Williamson a bit. It keeps coming up. Like it came up in the environmental episode we just did this week. It keeps coming up because everyone's feeling this void. Everyone's feeling this void. A lot of people who are from Bernie land, I think, were really fulfilled, if in retrospect, on a spiritual level, by the sense of community that came with getting behind a campaign that framed its objectives in moral terms. Our politics doesn't really talk in moral terms unless it's just judging the other. You're a deplorable, but there's no real substantive conversation about what kind of society do we want to be. Do we want to be a society where there's a zillion million empty homes? I'm sorry, I don't know the exact number. Or when there's only 500,000 homeless people? Do we want to be a country where billionaires get 30% richer in the middle of an economic crisis, overwhelming majority of Americans support a wealth tax, and somehow we can't get it implemented? Do we want to be a country where people die because they can't afford to pay for medical services? Do we want to be a country where if I'm rich and I want to go to Brown, I pay the sticker price of, what is it now, $60,000 a year, $70,000, what are we now? Okay, and if my parents don't have $60,000 a year, I have to pay an 8% interest rate, and I pay $250,000 for that same education over the course of a 10-year or 20-year loan. Is it just prescriptively, what kind of country do we want to be in? And I think with Bernie really, I'll speak for myself, when I heard him talk in 2016, it felt like it gave me permission to connect my morals and values and my politics in a way that I never really expected to happen. And when he went away, I think a lot of the infighting on the left and stuff is because people didn't know where to put all of that energy. And they really felt a loss, like a spiritual loss. And so that's all to say, I do think there's a value for spirituality. I don't think it's necessarily religion. Every religion was invented at some point, and I am fully confident that we can improve upon what's been done. But I do think it's useful, and why I think there's an interest in people like Marianne in having those kinds of conversations and relating to each other on a human level, and not starting with how we can pay for it conversations, understanding that we're in the richest country in the history of the world, and I have like a moral debt to you as another human being, even if you've transgressed, even if you've committed a crime, even if you had a baby out of wedlock. I care about you. Bernie gave us permission to care about other people. I miss that a great deal. Now it's all, you voted the wrong way, and so you deserve to get killed by this hurricane or whatever. The lights went out in Texas, you shouldn't have voted for a Republican, that during the winter power outage, all of that kind of disgusting stuff. And obviously Republicans say that stuff too, but it's disgusting. What do you think? Do you think we need to have more, we're lacking religion and that's part of the problem?
No, I mean, I think, you pointed out the First Amendment. What is it? The free exercise, but also the non-establishment. That's the two sides.
Yeah, get it off the money, too. It's ridiculous. That's a McCarthy-era BS.
It is a cultural issue. The places where you would have these kinds of conversations and try to move people by appealing to their values and their morals would be in a selective, freely entered into small community of like believers who affirm a particular thick moral catechism and try to live by it. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't know about the government, though. I think only indirectly, right? Only through, for example, the debate about whether school funding should be made available for parents to choose parochial schools to send their children, whatnot. I'm actually open to that to some degree, because I think giving parents choice about education is one lever for increasing the quality of educational experience and of indigent kids of all races in the country. So I'd be prepared to entertain that personally, but I don't know where a Democratic Socialist stands on that. And I want to ask you a different kind of question, though, if I can. Not to preempt. You got something?
Yeah,
it's really a comment, and it's not directed at Briahna. 90% of what you said I can agree with, so I'm not. It's really to Glenn, and it struck me that there was a sharp disparity between the way in which you developed the social cultural movement of civil rights, the 60s, the 70s, and the role it played in transforming people's attitudes in some respects in relation to, racial questions of aesthetics, etc. And I fully agree with you. But then when it came to the movement of now, right, you seem to, I won't go so far as to say disparage what you said. The direction it's moving in is not in the right direction. Where we should be doing something else, and I imagine that something else would include addressing those internal questions that you see as part of that problems in the black community. But it seems to me that the movement of now is, history never repeats itself. Or
I'm sorry, the movement of now.
The movement of now,
yes.
the movement that we're in.
Yes.
And I was just saying that, history never repeats itself. And Marx would have said, or the first time was tragedy and the second time was farce. But there's a parallel between that movement and this one in terms of a nationwide effort to end police violence, to address long-standing questions. Why is that parallel not the same, and why do you place a negative value on this movement, or in my reading of it, as opposed to the positive value which you place on the movement of then?
Yeah, this is the same question that Alden Morris asked me, the sociologist, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, that great book. We were actually in community college together back in Chicago in the late 60s, early 70s, because we came up in the same city at the same time. And he says, via Facebook, Alden says, Brother Glenn, man, these kids are just trying to change the world the same way that you and I were trying to change the world back in the day. They're just in a different register, they're speaking in a different voice, but they are trying to change the world. They need your help. They need your wisdom. Join them. And why have I not done that? Why have I not been able to look past the misgivings that I might have about this or that aspect of being myself, a man from the middle of the 20th century? The 21st century is a different world. There's different things going on. This is not your daddy's civil rights movement, this is the civil rights movement. And Alden actually has a long essay in Scientific American, I think it's in Scientific American, where he just does, where do movements come from and how do they get going? And often it's just a spark. It's something that's, so what if I don't think Michael Brown really had his hands up when Darren Wilson shot him in Ferguson, Missouri? So what if I have quibbles about this or that? Once the galvanizing forces start getting going, they accumulate on their own, they question authority, they raise, they're transgressive, they are, whatever, and why can I not get with that? It's a good question. Talk about it over dinner.
We'll talk about it over dinner.
Can I was hesitating because I wasn't sure if I could direct comments at Glenn.
At me?
Yes, but like with Brian,
Following up on Brian.
I don't have questions for her.
Oh, okay, well, I'm so glad.
No, the questions are for you, they're not for her.
Okay, that's
the
fine.
Comments. Okay. My comment is that I think there's a false dichotomy between saying that people can do things, or there are spheres within which people can act that can actually make a difference to improve their lives, and saying that structural racism isn't real. I think the two things can operate.
Both and, not even.
Yeah, so I think it's a false dichotomy, and maybe it's where you put the emphasis, but they're certainly operating at different levels. Before I ask the question I want to ask, I just want to come to the structural racism and not having any political effect. There is something about having people reflect on their privilege and where they are in life. And some terms, even if they might be overstated and overdone, there's a place for raising your fist, yes, and for saying, take a look inside, because that's how you change culture. And it's not just one culture that needs to be changed, if I'm to take your argument. So you cannot be talking about black culture needing to change. We're not thinking about white racist culture, because that's also part of the equation. How do you change that? And these things are there's a dynamic. It's not, they're not operating in separate realms. So those are my comments. The question I have is that argument about culture, does it translate to class? Does it translate to white America, white poor America? And do you use the same kind of arguments to say, because it sounds very much to me like the argument, the capitalist argument that says people are poor because they're not working hard enough. And hard work is the route to prosperity. And all you have to do is change your attitude to work, and you will be rich and prosperous. That totally ignores the structures that keep people poor.
Well, if I'm worried about behavior, I should be worried about behavior like opioid behavior and like, whatever. So I'm worried about white behavior, et cetera. And if I'm looking at out-of-wedlock births, I'm looking at a change in the society. I'm looking at the way that men and women are interacting broadly. I'm looking at what's in the popular culture. Black people don't control what's in the popular culture. We've seen a secular increase in single-parent families across the board. It's up to high 30% in the population as a whole, maybe 70% amongst black Americans, but 25% amongst white Americans and so forth. So I grant the point that if I'm speaking to the country about how it is that we raise our children or how we conduct ourselves in society, I wouldn't want to give a racial coloration to any such rhetoric. I would want to, if I were going to engage in any kind of hortatory or exhortation, calling the higher ground or whatever as a matter of national discourse, I would want to do it not in a racial, but in a transracial or a more universal tone. I think if I were speaking as an African American, quote, to my community, close quote, and I start with nobody is coming to save us, which is a political observation that, basically at the end of the day, we can wail and we can moan, but nobody is coming to save us. And again, I point to the Nation of Islam and the kind of defiant, independent, et cetera. I think it's quite okay to say, call black people to higher ground as the, rightful living up to our responsibilities to our children and to our ancestors. And this would be a nationalistic kind of discussion. It wouldn't be a black nationalistic, an intra-African American conversation. It wouldn't be a political conversation. Telling people that they wouldn't be poor if they were, I wouldn't say that. I don't know about a $15 an hour minimum wage, but I say that because I'm an economist, and I think what you want to do is you want to subsidize the wages of people. You want to allow the wage in the labor market to be whatever it is that the interaction between employers and workers generates. And then when you see the wages are too low, you can step in and subsidize that. You don't price people out of the labor market by mandating that employers pay everybody $15 an hour. This is just me, and this is more of almost a technical objection, or whatever. But if I'm doing a COVID relief package and I so structure it that it pays people more to stay at home than it does to work, that get actually literally more money from sitting at home for not working, it's okay to point out that has really bad incentives. You don't want to do that. That's not the way to structure your effort to assist people.
Why?
That kind of thing.
Why? What's the bad outcome? If people are being paid so little, then it makes more sense for them to stay home. Let's say what it often happens is that because childcare is so expensive, people divest from the labor market because they have to pay, $20,000 a year for childcare more in areas like this, urban areas. Then why should they work? I mean, isn't that the market? Like, isn't that the whole supply and demand core of it? And you said, you seem to believe that there's some minimum wage. You said if it's not enough, let's
No, what I said
raise.
is if you want to help people, subsidize their wages, don't mandate a minimum. So if they're getting $8 an hour or 10,
So like a UBI?
you can give them a $7 an hour subsidy. You simply don't mandate, because when I mandate $15 an hour, what I'm doing is I'm telling the employer, don't hire anybody who's not worth at least $15 an hour to you. But if I install a subsidy that tops off the wage up to $15 an hour, you find a job, you and the employer come to an understanding about what he's going to pay you. It's $8 an hour, not 15. Okay, we're going to give you $7 for each hour that you work out of the federal treasury through an earned income tax credit, so that the net effect will be that you'll be bringing home $15 an hour, but the employer won't be forced to hire somebody who's only worth $8 or $9 or $10 an hour at the $15 wage, because they're not going to do that, and you're going to price people out of the labor market. That's that argument.
Doesn't that incentivize the employer to just get away with this, like $1 an hour? Isn't that just a benefit to all of these employers on the government's dime? I don't know that I.
It sounds like a subsidy to the
You
employer.
can't force the employer to hire somebody. You can tell him what wage to pay, and if you do that, he'll not hire anybody who's not worth that wage to himself.
I mean, the argument that a lot of the lefts are making right now is that markets are inefficient, that people aren't getting paid the value of their labor, and what happened during COVID was that people had finally enough economic flexibility. I mean, we're making people, I mean, really think about it. $7.50 an hour, what costs $7.50? This is like.
It's a low wage. There's not an argument about that. And if we could make the wage anything we want to, why make it 15? Why not make it 25?
It 100% should be 25. Let the record reflect that if it was adjusted
there's
for
no free lunch.
inflation.
I'm sorry, I'm
But
the
it's not free. I mean,
messenger with the bad news. You cannot simply legislate people to be worth $25 an hour. You have to enhance their productivity to make them worth
productivity is up.
$25.
Productivity is so much higher than it was in the 1950s when the wage-adjusted, inflation-adjusted minimum wage was closer to $25 an hour.
Well, I think I have many questions about a lot of things, but the one thing I would say on this specific point is that, like, a potential way to get around this problem is one of the benefits of a federal jobs guarantee compared to a federal minimum wage, where if all people are guaranteed a job that they could go work for that paid them $15 an hour, you're not restricting the employer from hiring someone at $7 an hour, but you're telling all workers that they would only go.
You'd be forced to pay that, or else no one would come and work.
Exactly.
So that's the market.
Exactly.
That's the market. Everyone loves markets until it starts to hurt the people with the money and help the people without it.
I do have another question. Well, I have so many. Okay, one thing that I just want to say to Professor Loury.
And then we're going to have to conclude because we're at the hour.
Yeah, so this goes off of points that were made earlier, I think, and it's not more of a comment, but I'm reminded of something that I read in one of your books regarding there's a specific name for it that you give, but I don't remember the argument regarding the taxi driver who has a racial bias, who refuses to pick up black people because he thinks that they might rob him. So then all of the black people that would otherwise take the taxi are then forced to walk home or take the bus, and the people that he ends up picking up do rob him because those are the people that are now there, and therefore proving his bias towards him. I wonder if a similar argument, though with like relatively substantial tweaks, could be applied to the culture debate that you both were having earlier, in that by a government that in the very recent past has engaged in substantial racially biased policies, including redlining and other things, that have placed black people in the position that they are today, that because of that discrimination, because of that potential hopelessness that they have been, that they have felt because of the actions of the government, they then engage in these cultural practices that are problematic, and it creates this cycle that operates in a similar fashion of creating the truth because of the government's inability to operate properly or to effectively counteract that. And so that the way to break that cycle is relatively serious government intervention, as I think someone like Briahna might hope for.
So the system's always been rigged. And I hear a version of this in people. Yeah, totally. The system is rigged against me.
That's
for
not
racial
quite what he
reasons.
said, I don't think, but I don't want to put
No?
words in anybody's
Sorry, I don't
mouth.
wanna-
I heard him say there could be a vicious circle of cumulative causation where the historical mistreatment of African Americans might lead to patterns of behavior that then lock them into into a low status.
Well,
Did I
and
get
that
right?
that like low status generates the culture that you're problematizing, and so that it's because of a condition of poverty, as well as a true feeling that the government, the state, the society that they live in doesn't give a shit about them. They go commit violence, or they have children out of wedlock, and then because of those things, they continually lock themselves into this position in the ways that you've described, but also create a truth for certain people to justify the lack of assistance being provided to them, because it's actually really just about their culture.
Well, that actually is the argument I make in The Anatomy of Racial Inequality from 20 years ago. That sympathy, I call it biased social cognition. I say people need an account. They need to have a story they tell themselves, voters, the median voter, white people, need to have a story they tell themselves about why the condition of African Americans, the lower classes, is what it is. And they are reinforced in thinking that people are reaping what they have sown when they see behavior patterns that are adverse and that are problematic, but that the problematic behavior patterns may have emerged out of a history of marginalization and denial of resources and so forth, and it becomes kind of a vicious circle. The community needs sympathetic public intervention in order to heal the wounds of the historical violation, and yet the people who are in a position of granting that, in effect, through their support for the appropriate policies, are unwilling to do so because they look and they attribute the poor condition of the community to the patterns of behavior that they find to be unsatisfactory. So, I think there's something to that. You want to say something? We can adjourn. There's a reception down in the South Common Room on the second floor, which if you go down there, there may be some refreshments or something like that. I'm not advertising it. I'm just letting you know it's available. We can go down there for a few minutes. And then there's a dinner party later this evening at my home that you're not invited to. I apologize, but that we are eager to get on to. So let's adjourn. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Thank you for
Briahna.
coming.